Thanks for coming along tonight for our discussion on the May election. The topic is the May 2025 election, the parties, the issues, the prospects, and we've got two speakers. We're going to start off with Darrin Barnett. I'll introduce him very briefly. He's formerly Press Secretary to Prime Minister Gerard and currently is with Watson Advisory. And you see him a lot on Sky News and in other places in the media. And Pru Goward, of course, starts off as a journalist, was a Liberal minister, among other things. He was a Liberal minister in the New South Wales coalition government and gone back to journalism in a sense, and she writes fortnightly for the Australian Financial Review. So we're going to lead off with Darrin, we're going to go to Pru, and then questions and discussion. Darrin, you're very welcome.
Kerry Packer once quipped, "You only get one Allen Bond in your lifetime," and I've just had mine. After he sold the Nine network to Bond for around $1 billion in 1987 and bought it back 3 years later for just a quarter of the price. It wouldn't surprise me if someone makes a memorable quote in a month's time, "You only get one Donald Trump in your lifetime," and Anthony Albanese just had his. It's no secret that the government was struggling at the end of last year. Stubbornly high inflation, a bunch of interest rate rises and supply chain problems off the back of COVID have resulted in a proper cost of living crisis. A failed referendum on the Voice merely added to the perception that Albanese had struggled to get much done in his 3 years in office. All Peter Dutton needed to do was continue to reinforce one simple message: "Well, you're better off 3 years ago than you are today." But fast forward the clock, and a resurgent Albanese is now within sight of majority government, if you believe today's Sydney Morning Herald. I don't believe we're at that point, but he's in a much better position of getting the 72 seats that I think he needs to form minority government than he was even as little as 5 or 6 weeks ago. This is reflected in both opinion polls and betting markets. Neither is a reliable predictor, but as the late great journalist, you may know Paul Mullins from state government, used to always say to me, politics is about perception and momentum. And at the moment, both of those things favour the government. Right now, Anthony Albanese looks like a Prime Minister and Treasurer Jim Chalmers looks like he's in control, particularly given his experience in Wayne Swan's office during the GFC. The opposition leader, on the other hand, to be honest, looks rattled. He's been forced to backtrack from his plans to cut public service jobs and also a work from home backlash, and now has a $7 billion black hole to fill. As we head towards Easter and Anzac Day, time is not on Peter Dutton's side, and the chaos out of the United States isn't helping. Apparently, the polls say now that the coalition is behind 48 to 52. This is a single percentage point improvement for Labor since the previous news poll on March 30. But more importantly for everyday Australians, more than $160 billion was wiped off the share market this morning as fears of a full-blown trade war grip investors. The Australian dollar fell to its lowest level since COVID, falling to a low just below 60 cents, but strengthening to slightly above that by the close of trade. PFO was released today, which is the pre-election fiscal outlook, showing that Trump, his reciprocal tariffs will shock global trade and growth. The document says, the increase in tariffs announced over the past few days have been more significant than expected. The potential magnitude and persistence of the economic effects of these announcements has resulted in greater than usual uncertainty around the outlook. Despite this, the direct impact on Australia would remain limited, Treasury said. The top-line economic forecasts were unchanged from the March 25 budget. Voters often favour incumbents during a crisis, whether it's global financial crisis, the popularity of Kevin Rudd rose, September 11, 2001, the popularity of the Howard government rose, and during COVID, the popularity of the Morrison government rose. So, not surprisingly, Anthony Albanese today jumped on the bandwagon, expressing concern for jobs and economy and talking up in particular the Labor stronghold of superannuation. Chalmers, on the other hand, never one to miss a political opportunity, flagged potentially, obviously he has no role in the setting of interest rates, yet he flagged future rate cuts regardless. He said Australia is better placed and better prepared than our peers. This would be the worst time to risk a change of government to a coalition government which would make wages lower, taxes higher, and who has secret cuts to pay for nuclear reactors. Clearly, nuclear reactors has very little to do with what happened on money markets today, but politicians being as they are, you score your points when you have the opportunity. Dr. Chalmers, as he likes to be known, said the impact of Donald Trump's tariffs on the Australian economy should be manageable, but noted that markets were now expecting an interest rate cut of as much as 0.5 percentage points at the next RBA meeting. I don't predict or preempt those decisions, Chalmers said, but the market is certainly now expecting multiple interest rate cuts over the course of the year, beginning in May. Obviously, we will not get another decision from the RBA before the election, but there's a feeling amongst certainly Labor people that we have turned the corner, and that's an important part of the economic narrative that the government is trying to sell. The idea that one interest rate cut, and even though it's not a great deal of money and it begins in a year's time, but the idea of a tax cut in conjunction with that rate cut, they're trying to convince voters that we have turned the corner, the worst is behind us, trust us, and we can move forward together. They paint Peter Dutton as negative, probably not unreasonably, but the job of an opposition leader, that's part of the task. I read today, interestingly, that I saw something from Jackie Lambie in the Herald Sun. She basically said, giving the Albanese government a second term would likely deliver stability Australia needed amid global chaos brought by Trump. I would feel more comfortable or confident in seeing whether these guys have got what it takes in the next 3 years than going back from scratch to a party and then restarting. I don't think the country can afford that instability. Quite frankly, Australia needs to do a better job standing up for itself, and frankly, I haven't seen that out of either leader. If you want to play Trump, you've got to play right back at him. There needs to be repercussions for what he's done to Australia. Both our leaders do not have the courage to do that. Within that is the big problem for Peter Dutton. I've got to say, and I know it's being recorded, when I was a journalist in Canberra as a much younger man, Dutton was a junior minister and he was one of the more pleasant people to deal with at a personal level from either side of politics. He always took the phone call, answered questions himself, was available and quite generous with his time. And I think to this day he does maintain good relations with the press gallery, as does Albanese, but Dutton is a fairly upfront kind of guy, pretty easy to deal with. But his problem is that his current policy settings, he gets hit from either side. If he's middle of the road, the hard right peel off, they want him to be harder. And if he goes towards the right, he can't win the election because he'll win the election from the centre. So we have this extraordinary scenario, much like the 2019 election with Bill Shorten, that the story of the day continues to be Peter Dutton and it continues to be Dutton and Trump. And when the story of the day is not the government and the referendum on what the government has achieved in the last 3 years, it is that much more difficult to win from opposition, particularly in a time of crisis. The coalition's strong suits of national security and economic management won't work like they normally do during a domestic election campaign. And as already mentioned, there is already a $7 billion black hole entirely of his own making. Everything he does on national security will be seen as Trump light, and voters don't seem to like it. At the end of last year, there was a possibility that Mr. Dutton could have identified himself as a change maker in times where governments were being voted out due to stubbornly high inflation, cost of living pressures. We saw state governments, international governments, but much like Bill Shorten, Trump and Dutton are the story. I can't see this changing over the next month. But it's worth going back, even taking into consideration what Trump has done in the last week and what the impact will be on our share market and other things, Australia at the end of 2024 was not a happy place in terms of voter intentions. The coalition, both parties' primary vote had slipped, and we'll talk about the rise of independents a little bit later on. The coalition was polling well in outer suburbia, and interestingly, amongst those born overseas and speaking a language other than English at home. This is a marked turnaround from the historical connection between migrant communities and Labor voting, which has been the norm since the Second World War. The coalition is not having much success with 18 to 34s. I'm not sure that Labor is either, and I'm not sure that we really know how they're going to vote, because traditional methods of polling don't really find people in that cohort, particularly the much younger voters who absorb their information from TikTok rather than any kind of mainstream media that most people in this room are familiar with. Labor had lost its gender advantage that it had in 2022, but it seems to have got that back, mainly off the announcement from working from home. Over half of Labor's vote was soft. Voters wanted a plan on housing and cost of living, and almost half of the electorate believed Australia is on the wrong track. 60% of Labor voters said cost of living was their most influential issue on their voting intention, noting grocery prices, energy bills and gas bills as their main concern. Close to a third of voters said they were spending more than 40% of their household income on rent. Half said they were spending more than 30% of their household income on rent and mortgage. More than half believed their future standard of living would be worse than pre-COVID, and just 20% believed it would be better. Disappointed and frustrated were two of the main words that were coming out of focus groups at the end of 2024. Just 28% of those 18 to 34-year-olds had positive associations with politics, 50% had negative. More than 1/3 of the electorate felt their values were not aligned with Labor or the coalition, and a quarter don't believe they have shared values of any of the parties, including the Greens and the Teals. Dutton had improved his ready for government measurement from -20 to net positive, and Albanese was in quite some trouble. But that mood for change, two things. One, has it dissipated? And secondly, was there really a choice? Paul Kelly in The Australian in March noted the following: the media naturally is obsessed by the competition between Albanese and Dutton. Yet this misses the point entirely. Neither offers an adequate agenda. The campaign shapes as a contest between two highly unsatisfactory offerings. This is so obvious, yet we seem incapable of recognising the obvious and demanding something better. Don't fall for the myth that this election is a great battle of ideology and ideas. The rhetorical differences are huge and the policy differences are minor, energy aside. Don't expect the coalition to run big on tax reform or a bold winding back of Labor's workplace laws. Dutton's focus is on 7 quarters of shrinking GDP per capita. He was backed in by the economist Chris Richardson, who said, "We as an electorate have asked our politicians to avoid challenging us. It's becoming easier to become Prime Minister, but harder to do something as Prime Minister." In this election, and this is an astounding fact, the two sides seem to be agreeing on mediocrity. In terms of forward estimates, they agree on more than 99% of the budget. That's an acceptance of a status quo that is failing. We have stopped fighting harder for our future, and our politicians have stopped challenging us. And that put us in a remarkable situation at the end of last year, where having a look at seat numbers, and I'm not using an AV, so I'll just list some seats, but it was entirely possible that we would see a change of government. Here in New South Wales, the seats Robertson, Bennelong, Patterson, Gilmore, potentially Macarthur, potentially Eden Monero, Throsby, Macquarie, Werriwa, Dobell, Reid, Shortland, Hunter, and maybe even McKellar, who's currently held by a Teal. That list has now shrunk. I think it's probably now limited to Gilmore, Bennelong, Patterson, maybe Robertson. I don't think Macquarie will go. I don't think, and certainly with the public service stuff, Eden Monero won't go. The Central Coast, the rest of the Central Coast should be fine. Reid will stay with Labor. So we probably leave New South Wales, head to Victoria. Libs will pick up Aston, Chisholm and McEwen, but I don't think they will win Hawke, Dunkley or Corangamite. Labor at the end of last year was likely to lose Sturt. I think that's probably shifted around. But the two gains that were penciled in at the end of last year of the seat of Lyons in Tasmania and Lingiari in the Northern Territory are both very much still on the table. In Western Australia, the newly created seat of Bullwinkle will probably go to the Coalition. It may go to the Nationals rather than the Liberals, but we will have to see what happens on polling day. And the seat of Curtin is at genuine risk, depending on which way you look at it. It's not at risk, it's coming back if it's your seat, but I think Curtin, there's a very strong possibility that that will return back into the Liberal fold. The seat of Tangney is not a Labor seat. It may be that Labor holds on, but it's certainly not something that Labor would expect to hold long term. As previously discussed, the Coalition's strong suits of national security and strong economy are generally considered tier 1 issues in Australian elections. Defence should also be added to this mix. Traditional Labor strongholds of health, education and IR and workplace relations, plus the fairly recent addition of climate change, are generally considered tier 2. In 2019, COVID plus the perceived shortcomings of the Morrison government saw the Coalition lose ground on the economy while the Teals filled the space on climate and environment. In 2016, the infamous Mediscare campaign almost got Labor over the line. This time, the Coalition has already scored a couple of massive own goals. It's very surprising to me that they did not have a containment strategy ready for when they announced that they were going to sack 41,000 public servants and make people work from home. All of my information that rather than being a Labor scare campaign, later that same day that the new policy was announced, MPs in Liberal offices, their phones started to ring, wondering what's going to happen to my job in Western Sydney. I've realigned my work-life balance. And I guess the point here, that if you can play into the perceived kind of difficulties for a particular party, so you can lean into Labor on national security, you can sometimes lean into Labor on economy, but you can also lean into the Coalition on health, IR and climate change.
Thanks, Gerard, and thank you, Darrin, for that very comprehensive analysis. And I certainly didn't come prepared to do anything like that. I thought I would approach this a bit more philosophically, and I'd start with the words of the immortal and often misused words of Zhou Enlai, which were, "It's too early to tell." Because in the climate I think we are now in, particularly the international climate, of course, I think it really is too early to tell. We are seeing an amazing drop in the Australian dollar. That could recover next week. We are having a Treasurer who's immediately predicted a 50-point drop in interest rates, which means he's expecting there to be a recession. When did job losses work for a government? There's a long way to go before May the 3rd, even though that's only 3 weeks away, as we've just been discussing. And of course, history, the Coalition comes into this campaign with history absolutely not on their side. The last time a first-term government was tossed out was 1931, and for very good reason. Nothing really to do with whether or not you're going to give this tax grab or this tax take, but really more the fact that mostly Australians say 3 years is not long to be in government, particularly after 9 years of another government, and you need to give people longer than 3 years, or in Hawke's case 2 years, 6 months or whatever it was. So for that reason alone, that Australians think that 3 years, probably usually less, is not long enough to really test a government. nobody really thought there was any other option but that we would see the return of the Albanese government. And the fact that the polls are where they are, given that history, is an extraordinary recognition of how much this government has struggled, because it has all that going with it. Of course, we live I would not say in quite the same times as 1931, but we certainly are living in a period, and as the events of the last day, the last week, remind us, we are living in a period of extreme economic acuity, where on the flick of a switch, the world trading system has changed extraordinarily. I actually am not in my heart convinced that 10% is a very significant tariff. I sort of get Trump's point about all the non-trading barriers that the Americans in their naivety put up with, whereas the Europeans are so clever at playing all those little non-tariff trading barriers. We're quite good too. So despite that personal reservation, I hope Peter didn't hear that, I think we are living in a period where people have a great sense of economic crisis. And the collapse in the share markets, which in my view is not justified entirely by tariff changes, but is more a reflection of the methodology and the analysis and the rhetoric which accompanied it, which have been so incoherent and disruptive and puzzling. I think that's what's driven the markets to react so strongly. But they can just as quickly come back from that. Markets are very variable, and they are human beings, and people sell shares, and formulas tell them when to sell shares. When you know all of that, so I think the fact that the world is in the hands of this unprecedented period after 30 odd years of the mantra of free trade, and suddenly we're seeing the biggest economy in the world wanting to challenge that, people are uncertain. And uncertainty always plays to the incumbent, and particularly when the uncertainty is created by the conservative side of politics. It's obviously going to favour the other side. So I think that, as you have suggested, Darrin, Albanese is a lucky guy. I mean, he was lucky to get COVID in the first election, so he didn't have to speak for a week, which meant that we didn't pick up on some other errors we might have picked up on. But he's been very lucky this time, because there is this mood of fear which is being driven by what the markets are seeing in the Trump reforms or changes. I think the other thing is, of course, that there is, again, like 1931, there is a looming sense of security crisis, which I appreciate from every pollster I've spoken to is not being picked up in the polls yet. But in my sense, people are conscious that, you know, the Chinese Navy is circumnavigating Australia whenever it feels like it, and that there are big shifts in global politics and global alliances, and big challenges even to a country like Australia, which has always had a very simple foreign policy, that this is all about to change, and Australia might actually have to come into its own and stand much more on its own 2 feet and not rely on its historical alliances. So I think this is a bit like 1931. And I think 2 things explain why the polls are so close. And as Darrin said, until quite recently, was the odds were on a coalition minority government, and slightly longer odds on a coalition majority government. I think those 2 features were driven by the Albanese government's. Some of its reforms have not been appealing. The fact that it didn't bring down electricity prices when it said it would. I think Chris Bowen is an alarming figure, and I think most people identify him as an alarming figure. And although industrial relations has historically been seen as a Labor strength, I think the extent of the current round of industrial relations reforms are just starting to hit the building industry. And I think within the next year or so, we will see the full force that they have. I was at a conference the other day, and one of the human resource managers said the last year, he said the unions have just rejected every proposal because of this new clause in the Fair Work Act, which says that if you can't come to a settlement within 9 months, then it goes to the Fair Work Commission, which is of course stacked with Labor appointments, and you're going to get a good deal. So although traditionally people have always seen the Labor movement, I suspect, as rather benign, and Labor's industrial changes as benign, I think this new round of industrial relations changes is actually very alarming, it could well see the end of our biggest industrial sector, if you like, the building sector. So I think there is a sense of uncertainty about what's going to happen, but to me there is no doubt that when an electorate is uncertain and it's only just elected a change of government, it's going to want to think that there should be a change. But what is the big thing? Of course, it's cost of living, cost of living, cost of living. And that is why Peter Dutton did so well last year, and that is why he was so contestable until only a month ago, because one thing everybody understands is, as John Howard said, what's going on in your hip pocket, and every Australian knew that they were worse off. Then in the last month, I think we've seen those industrial relations changes. Although they've started to unsettle people, I think the real difference has been the big international changes, and the sense of fear that I think is now capturing the world's markets, and I think that's been very fortunate for the Prime Minister. But as I say, it is too early to tell. We do not really know whether in a week's time President Trump decides that he's gone far enough and he's going to change his mind entirely on tariffs and a whole lot of other things. And I think where this is an election of a kind I've never in my lifetime ever experienced, which is an election in which most of the levers are being pulled now by the international actors, rather than much that Australian governments can do a lot about, except not to overreact. I thought Jim Chalmers' reaction today, interest rates are going to go down by 50 points, was a sign of panic, because what it's telling you is he thinks unemployment's going to go up severely, and nobody wants to see their kid lose a job or lose their job themselves. So I think we have got a long way to go, but I do think history has always been on the side of a first-term government being returned, and the fact that Peter Dutton has done so well in getting us this close, I say that without any reservation, I think is a sign that despite all of that, Australians have very deep reservations about the government, and it will not take much for that to flip back. I think it's a very febrile environment. The Prime Minister's only going to need to make a couple of mistakes. The opposition's only going to need to write a couple of things like unemployment or further wage increases, which people can't afford. There's only going to have to be another round of insolvencies and people losing their jobs. And I think the climate will change enormously. We both wanted to talk about prospects, and I think that's because if you come from a mainstream party, then the worst thing for Australia at this time would be a minority government, and that is the real tragedy. That the Teals and the Greens are populist. I mean, how amazing that Jackie Lambie has suddenly discovered a sense of responsibility, when really most of those people in the middle, they only survive because they vote for anything popular and they never vote for anything hard. I have never known an independent to back anything difficult. And why would you? Your job, you're never going to be in government, you never have to make a decision. All you need to do is remind people of how good you were in supporting what's good and evaporating into a puff of smoke when something bad happens. And I think the worst thing for Australia at the moment, if the next result would be a Greens-Labor government, which is probably the most likely, but it depends on how many seats, Green seats, are lost in Queensland. There's a prediction of up to 3, 1 for Labor and 2 for the coalition, but it might not be that. And I think that the second option, of course, is a coalition between Labor and the Teals, or the coalition and the Teals, and to go into coalition with populists is extremely difficult when you have to make very tough decisions. And that's really the message, that if you think your country's in trouble now, the last thing you need is a populist government that works day and night to keep its votes in the parliament instead of working day and night to keep the country afloat. Productivity has never been worse, absolutely never been worse. Our major markets are shrinking as our output of everything that we do well is being limited and restricted by a whole lot of factors, including, of course, climate concerns about production of gas, mining and its pollution, and all those concerns have all come together with a lot of IR reform, so-called, that has made us more and more uncompetitive. And the last thing we need is another 3 years where populism sways the day. But I think there's plenty of questions you've got, and my only view, as I said, is the view I began with, which is it's too early to tell. Thank you.
How do you regard the independents? Because there are about 14 of them, aren't they? And then there are the Greens as well. So how do you see it? Do you see it the way Pru see it, or do you see it another way?
A couple of things. I think Brisbane, it'll go 1-1-1. I think the Greens will keep Griffith, Ryan will go back to the Liberals, and I think Labor may win Brisbane. Independents more broadly, one of the joys of being Julia's press secretary was dealing with a minority parliament. And there's people, and the media played a role in this, it was not as difficult as people made it out to be. We had a very favourable Senate, so I think the number of bits of legislation passed by Gerard was 500-600, it was a lot. And it was done, ironically, Jo Halen, who has had her own travails in recent times, was the person in Gillard's office who was in charge of dealing with Oakeshott, Windsor, the rest of the crossbench, and she was very good at that job. So in the end, we had a hostile lower house, but a favourable Senate, and the reverse of that is true in most parliaments. No one, apart from John Howard in 2004, has had a majority Senate in recent times. And you might even argue that some of the things that he tried to do when he had that majority cost him that 2007 election. Work choice has been the obvious one. But independents, I think increasingly they are beholden to their own electorate only, and the narrow concerns of each electorate make it very difficult. If you're the coalition and you're trying to have a party room with, Bridge, I know she's a national, but anyone from Western Australia and Zali Steggall, it's going to be hard. And for Labor, I don't think Wilkie's going to come back inside the tent after last time. Labor doesn't want the Greens to be in coalition because it guarantees they don't win the next election. But equally, the Teals, they're Liberal seats. If they join a Labor minority government, there's a very real prospect that they don't get re-elected in 3 years' time. So it's going to be complicated and messy, and I think a majority government would be preferable, but I do think we're headed for minority.
Do you want to add to that? Okay.
Darrin, you said that we've turned the corner, or we think we've turned the corner, and then the Treasurer predicts a 50 basis point drop in interest rates. How do you reconcile those 2 points of view, or how do you think he might get called on to reconcile those 2 points
I
of
suspect his first words will be, I have no jurisdiction in telling the RBA what to do. Just reflecting my own personal view. I'm not sure what's going to happen with broader unemployment, other parts of the economy. I think he's trying to send a smoke signal to those experiencing a cost of living crisis that there might be some relief on the way, without talking about that second half of the equation, which is that would only occur if there were other parts of the economy impacted.
And you know that as the Treasurer, he absolutely can't do that. He absolutely can't, because his job is to make sure the Reserve Bank believes that it's independent. Every time he talks about interest rates, a question mark goes up in the entire financial world that this guy is heavying the head of the Reserve Bank, as I think he probably has been. So it was very foolish of him. To your point, if he wanted to make people feel better about cost of living, that's what he needed to say. We've got cost of living relief measures. But once treasurers start wandering into interest rate cuts, to me there's only one conclusion, which is you heavy them.
Yeah, this is not a very complicated question, but this is the most unusual first-term government to be so narrowly a majority. We're all forgetting that this government is hanging by its fingers with about one seat in the lower house. And you mentioned how there are seats that were thought to possibly go back to the Liberals but wouldn't, but you couldn't name one, except one where it was cancelled out in Queensland, where Labor would be making up a bigger majority. So in other words, we're looking, I would say, at a minority Labor government
I think
at best,
that's right.
and there's no way around that.
I can't see Labor getting to 76, and I sort of said that in the speech, but I don't see the seats that allow that to happen. Seats like Aston was a by-election, a couple of the Western Australian seats. And I think 2 or 3 will go in Victoria and 2 or 3 will go in New South Wales. So I think it's a minority government, and whoever, I think the magic number is 72. If either side can get to 72, they have pretty strong legitimacy to then demand first dibs on negotiating with the crossbench.
Philip.
If as conventional wisdom has it, in a compulsory voting polity, elections are won from the centre, how can one ever have the battle of ideas that Paul Kelly longs for?
It takes a courageous opposition because, as you know, governments are so constrained by the pressure of government. If they had a new idea, they'd have already been doing it in government. So I think it is incumbent on oppositions. But as we can see, despite Mr. Kelly's dream, that is not the reality of the electorate today. An opposition and a government today don't just look straight ahead at the enemy on the other side. They look to the Greens on one side, the Teals on the other, some crazy little independent who thinks he or she has got a chance in some very vulnerable seat. They're balancing a whole lot of additional considerations that in the good old days of majority parliaments, two-party parliaments, they didn't have to do. But I do think courage is possible, but for the public, for the electorate to accept the courage and the often what would need to be quite radical changes for Australia, you've first got to convince the Australian electorate that we're in a mess. And I don't think we've done that yet. I don't think that the country is enough on its knees for Australians to think they need something radical. So most people don't know what productivity is. They have no idea that everybody's sleepwalking. They have no idea what's happened in the public service, the extra 41,000 jobs, and I suspect not one extra output as a result because it's all been dissipated across a whole lot of other inefficiencies. The message first has to be we are on our knees, and that's why Paul Keating talked about the Banana Republic. He too, he could see all those graphs, he knew where they were all going. That's why he said it. It was that attention-getting, this is where we're going moment that enabled him and and Hawke to get through some reforms that normally Australians wouldn't have accepted. But I don't think Australians think they're there yet, even though I think it's just around the corner. We're about the same age, so well into my 70s. I don't think I have ever felt such a greater sense of fear about my country's future. But I don't think the electorate feels that. Yes, they're very worried about their cost of living, but they are not concerned about productivity and what it means for growth, the collapse of Australian competitiveness, what that means for the jobs of hundreds of thousands of people. The future, who owns Australia even, who owns Australian culture? These all become contestable when a country's on its knees.
Two very quick things. The only two political leaders who've tried to have a comprehensive change agenda were Tony Abbott in the 2014 budget and Bill Shorten in the 2019 election, and it spelled the end of both of their careers. So I'm not sure who's going to take that risk.
Because the Hawke reforms occurred from government. He started with that incredible summit, sat there every day on national television, smiling at all his mates in industry and getting an amazing deal out of the ACTU. But he did it from government.
And that's true of John Howard's tax reforms too, from government.
I'm in Wentworth and I'm confronted every time I leave my front door by Spender's placard, "Your vision, your voice." How can these shysters get away with that when they vote for Green most of the time? I know how often they do, but why aren't the wider electorate, why aren't they being told how they vote and what their record actually is?
I think in the end, the people, I live in Wentworth as well, the people in Wentworth will cast their vote and the people always get it right. So you can argue with the tactics, you can argue with the core flutes, but we all know the game and we play the game.
That's the job of her opponent, isn't it? To make that point over and over. As Barry O'Farrell once said to me when we were newly in government, he said, when you are sick of saying the same thing over and over, that's when they start listening.
So, quick question. The Liberal Party no longer holds any seats on Sydney Harbour or in Melbourne's east. On the flip side, Labor, which once had quite respectable representation in the regions, is these days probably limited to the Hunter Valley, parts of Tasmania and the NT. A bit of analysis, what do you think is more likely this election? The Liberal Party making inroads back into that kind of traditional territory, or the Labor Party making inroads in some of those regional electorates?
Yeah, it's fine.
So, that shows up my height deficit, Gerard. And I wore flat shoes as well.
He's standing on a platform.
True.
Yes, take your shoes off. Take your high heels off. What a nerve coming in here in those. Look, I think I would have agreed with you until the share market collapsed, because all those seats on Sydney Harbour full of wealthy retirees, like some of the people in this room, weren't particularly affected by the cost of living crisis. They could cope with a bit more. I mean, my electricity bill is the highest it's ever been, Mr. Bell's is the highest it's ever been, but we somehow manage. But when your income starts to go down because the share market has collapsed, and you see tens of thousands of dollars written off your income, I think those seats will take notice. And that's why I say it's all too early, because this is very new, and it could all come back in a week. All those collapses on the share market could be written off in a week, or they might be worse. But I think for the first time in the last 3 years, those seats which are, in my view, inoculated from usual economic concerns about industrial relations, interest rates, because they don't have mortgages, because they've bought everything, and their cost of living, what they're not inoculated from is a collapse in their income.
I think Labor in Victoria is going to have some challenges. out of suburbia, McEwen, the Liberals were confident, although it's died down a little, about Bendigo. Even the seat of Hawke, which funnily enough is where I grew up, that's sort of 40 kilometres from the CBD of Melbourne. I can't see Labor losing. They may lose McEwen, but the other two they won't. What I think is interesting is what are the Teals going to do with respect to Labor seats in the fullness of time? The state seat of Fremantle nearly got won by either an Indie or a Green, might have been an Indie. That same person is now contesting against Josh Wilson. They probably will get some assistance out of Climate 200.
Josh Wilson is where? Josh Wilson is where? What's it?
He's Labor.
Yeah, what's it?
Fremantle. And the seat of Canberra, David Smith, I think there's a Climate 200 backed independent running in that race. So what you describe, I think if Climate 200 or another group that is similar start to back independents in Labor seats, that will push a further realignment.
Okay, so question down there.
Yes, thank you. Pru, I know that your lady husband, David Barnett, was very close to John
No
Howard.
relation.
No, none at all. It's okay. You're safe.
Sorry.
Okay, can we just get to the question?
Indeed,
Sorry.
indeed, though one of the biographies of John
Can't hear
Howard.
you. You've got to speak in.
Do you have any views on how John Howard, if he were in Peter Dutton's position, would be conducting this campaign?
It's a book. Yes. Look, I would hate to speak for John Howard. I mean, John Howard is probably the most capable person in the country to speak for himself. But I will note that whenever there was good economic reform on the table, he supported it. And that took huge courage. Andrew Peacock hated him for it, resented the fact that John wanted good economic reform when Andrew thought that the easy politics were just to oppose it. And the easy politics were in opposing it. But that is not how John Howard saw the world, and he saw Hawke as a moment. Hawke could do something he couldn't do. He could get on with the ACTU and get that accord going in a way that Malcolm Fraser couldn't, of course, and probably neither could Andrew Peacock. It's perhaps easier to do that when you're the shadow treasurer, not the shadow leader. So maybe Andrew did have a point, but I think one of the reasons John Howard, if I might say, has been such a successful Prime Minister and remained a successful figure is because he had long longevity in opposition as well as Treasurer in the Malcolm Fraser government and as Prime Minister, and through all of that he always stood up and said what he thought and believed in, and I think he had enormous respect for that. But you've got to be around a long time, Peter. Yes, but that's right, you have been, I've been, and to get that sort of reputation, you have to have been around a long time, and I think neither Mr Albanese nor Peter Dutton have that benefit.
The last political leader or opposition leader to oppose tax cuts was Beazley, 98. It didn't end well.
Very true.
It seems to me that a lot of the Teals got up who should have been Liberal candidates. They got up because the Liberals wouldn't put female candidates in, and a lot of educated women in those electorates that probably would have voted more tend to vote Liberal, voted for those Teals. And I'm thinking of North Shore electorates, I'm thinking of Allegra Spender. Is there any possibility of Dutton doing a deal and making Allegra the Minister for Finance or something like that?
I'm sure Allegra would like to follow in the family footsteps, that her father was an MP, her grandfather, I think, was the Attorney General in the Menzies government. There is no doubt that people who spend time in Parliament would enjoy being in a party of government at some stage. It won't happen this cycle, but you couldn't rule it out in future cycles, particularly, I know she may not win, but Kate Chaney, Allegra Spender, they are Liberal royalty. They are not, they're not your sort of average Teal candidate who have come from another political background.
Well, I think that's a possibility. I think it would be difficult for a Labor spender to go into government as distinct from sitting in that pivotal position on the crossbench like the three amigos did. I think that would be an extra step, and the deal Mr. Dutton would have to make with her would have to be considerable.
It won't be Dutton who makes that deal, it'll be a moderate leader. I don't think Dutton can make that deal with the Teals, rightly or wrongly.
I just wanted to know what you both think of Peter Dutton's move to link defence/national security with trade in the context of getting a better deal out of Donald Trump and the US administration. And does the electorate care about that? Is it a mistake, or what do you think of it?
I think to be fair, I think he wound that back, didn't he? But anyway.
Pardon?
Yeah, he did wind it back,
Yeah.
but he still spoke off the cuff. I don't think it was a wise move. I think when you're in opposition, you can get away with a lot more than when you're in government. And if you're the opposition leader, you're trying to squeeze yourself into the back end of a story. And when you're either Albanese or Penny Wong, you need to be very serious in your response, and you can be a bit more flippant as opposition leader. I don't think it was a wise thing to say, but I don't think it matters really at all in the broader context.
Cost of living, cost of living, cost of living, that's all he really needs to talk about. He hasn't entirely stepped back from those comments. And if you think about the way Mr. Trump addresses an argument, he pulls everything in. There are all sorts of trade-offs he's prepared to do: immigration, illegal migrants for tariff cuts and so on. And maybe Peter Dutton's not totally unwise to send the signal to Mr. Trump that he's got a lot of enemies. Europe has decided to get together, and that's a disaster. That's never happened before, or not since the war. And Mr. Trump could be looking for allies, and although we're not a significant player on the world security stage, it's better to have us on your side than against you, particularly down in this area of the world. So I don't know that it was altogether the wrong thing to say, just to sort of send a little bit of a tickle up. You know, Mr. Trump, there's two of us that can play at this game, and maybe even more.
You've both talked about the need for both sides to be conservative in their approach, to not rock the boat. But this is the first election where we will have the majority voters won't be baby boomers. They won't be the people who want people to be careful. They actually want people to rock the boat. How is that going to, will that in some way be difficult for both parties at this election day when you've got the younger voters saying, we actually want a radical leader?
Well, let's start with Darrin.
Sure. I think what we've seen is Labor in particular have moved to remove HECS debts. There's some movement on renters' rights. Housing affordability is always approached through the lens of increasing the supply of affordable housing rather than trying to impact house prices per se. So I think you're going to see a lot more of those types of policies going forward, and I think the Liberals have to adopt similar policies in order to remain, in the hunt for those inner city electorates. Probably, seat of Ryan, for example, you have to be seen as responsive. Areas around, like Monique Ryan's seat is a very low median age. They have to play the game, and that's where the votes are going to be in the future. But no one knows how they're going to vote, to be honest.
And you might say they want a more radical government. In the end, they've got pockets, they pay taxes, they have jobs, and the HECS debt forgiveness is an enormous debt for them to carry for the rest of their lives and their children. I mean, all this spending is actually going to that very generation. They're the ones who are going to carry it in the future. That billions and billions of dollars of debt that's arisen from both sides making huge promises is all going to be paid for by this future generation. Very easy to be radical, as what does Malcolm Turnbull say? None so impotent as the pure. And when you're not earning, when you're living at home or living with mum and dad, then you can afford to have radical ideas and want to see radical things. I remember all of that. When your life is about getting food on the table, your kids getting enough shoes on their feet to go to school, being able to afford the excursions and being able to afford your home loan or your rent, suddenly that's what becomes important. And I think that's what will happen to this generation, as it has all generations.
So are you as pessimistic as that, Darrin, as Pru is on the economy?
Hard to say. I think we will see some interest rate cuts, and that will act to stimulate the economy. What happens in terms of employment? It's too early to say. There is a chance that we'll end up in a deep global recession off the back of what Trump has done in the last week or so. And no one really knows what he has up his sleeve. No one knows what his plan is. And it's possible he doesn't even know himself. And for that reason, it makes it really hard for reasonable people to predict what a person who is unreasonable and chaotic is going to do.
Now, just a very quick Zoom question coming for Pru, just to clarify your last point. The question is, you're suggesting that there are severe economic problems without Trump and without the tariff controversy and without the change in international trade. So that would be worse on your analysis than what you're already imagining is happening or stating is happening.
You have to tell me that again. I didn't get that.
Well, the suggestion is that, if I can get it right, that you are pessimistic irrespective of Trump
I'm
and
pessimistic
tariffs.
for Australia because of the productivity equation. When you've got a senior minister saying you can have real wage rises without productivity growth, you haven't got Trumponomics, you've got Albonomics. And that's, to me, just as terrible for Australia. So even if it weren't for Trump, if it weren't for what's going on at the moment, Australia's future is perilous. Economic future is perilous until we accept some very hard treatment, like we have to get ourselves back working again. We have to have apprentices. We have to have firms that can prosper. We have to have building companies that can build without unions standing there with their thugs, stopping you from getting onto the site unless you've got a card. We've got a lot of things we can do here that have absolutely nothing to do with Donald Trump.
Many thanks, folks. Well, I feel a bit depressed, folks. So going home for a gin and tonic or more. Look, that was a great discussion tonight. So to Darrin Barnett and to Pru Goward, it was informative and lively and above all considered, which is what we like. So well done to both of you tonight. They'll make for good papers when they're published eventually and when they go out on the camera. So well done tonight, and we'll have you back sometime in the future, if there is a future.